Okay, got a couple minutes. Think we're okay. All right, testing one, two, three. Hello. Welcome to Wednesday office hours, the autonomouscollective.net. And there are prior videos that will cover the opening and closing chapters, which I hope you'll take a look at. I think it's actually quite worthwhile to consider. That is, some people like to have big models of what they think is going to happen, socialism, etc. And I don't have many objections to Lausen's treatment of this. So we'll go through this, and I hope you'll find this somewhat useful. I've included the two videos, prior videos. We're going to look at the why this book and my method. His book is The Long Transition Towards Socialism and the End of Capitalism by Torkil Lauesen. And it's a free book, and you can download it from Iskra Books. It's in PDF. And I hope you'll find that useful. So we're going to look at why this book, my method, and then we'll look at the conclusion towards a strategy for the transition to socialism. And there's a lot in between that, but I would hope that you just get a sense of this. You may want to read it for yourself and take your time. I think this is as good as any in terms of talking about where one needs to have one's affiliations, one not to be so disappointed that actually existing socialism is hard to get to or get back to for some people, and to also account for what I think, at least in these couple of weeks, is a kind of resistance to treating post-war Western Marxism as a kind of general category as either, not Marxist enough, not material enough, too bourgeois, too petty bourgeois, whatever, however you want to look at that. That's one of the criticisms that I think current analysis needs to cope with. And so we'll look at not only this, but uh, Gabriel Rockhill's work, which is much different, but is treating the same set of questions. That is of how are we to deal with anti-imperialism in the 21st century. So you can watch the video at your leisure. That's the whole point of doing the entire set of readings as an audio or a video, as a recording. So I can just pick and choose in this little session what the primary issues are. And so I've given you a general kind of introduction. I think it is the question of capitalism, imperialism, um, uh, the discussion of um, why socialism is not there yet. Many people have tried to do it, and I think he presents an argument that doesn't create real problems. I mean, I think he lays it out in a very useful way. Difference between north-south, south-south, how to account for different varieties of socialism, the general problematic of the People's Republic of China as a kind of state capitalism. All of those are handled. I actually find it quite useful in that sense that he sort of addresses most of the issues. I mean, the larger issues are ones that one has to sort out for oneself. What is or what are class struggles, etc. So, anyway, it is a product of age that we sort of worry about this. Things seemed so different when one's younger. One has some hope that maybe even there will be, socialism in my time, etc. I can see that that's just not going to happen, but one needs to sort of reconcile these matters and not get so tied up in, well, what's my legacy, blah blah blah. Um, So, in this book, he examines major revolutionary attempts from 1848 to the present, to 2023, whatever, 24, to see what can be learned in terms of building an organization, developing political and economic strategies, many revolutions and stuff that he doesn't cover. And yeah, there's a disappointment in varieties of socialism: Soviet Union, China, Eastern Europe, Cuba, Algeria, Mozambique, etc. And um, there's a series of efforts to build socialism within the sea of capitalism. The mode of production is capitalism. And in fact, only Stalin claimed that socialism was established in the Soviet Union in 1936. That's best left for a whole nother discussion, I suppose. And they occur within a dialectical relation with capitalism. Um, and he's only covering socialism in this book. His prior book, The Global Perspective, does more on capitalism itself, which is part of a larger issue that he covers in terms of world systems theory. Wallerstein, and but there's other world systems theorists as well, and I think he frames the issues of world system theory in a useful way. Doesn't make it so static or sort of stuffy. He assumes that that as the planet moves, one needs to sort of work through these kinds of issues. So he gives us a general history and getting up to Marx, of course. And he works through the issue for Marx and Engels about, that they're not the be all and end all, but they do give us methodology that is still quite useful. That is dialectic. It has it's sort of mobile. It it does a fair amount of things. And so this is a useful book in terms of giving you a introduction to the sort of the history of socialism, or attempts to do socialism, which occur in a variety of ways. And needless to say, most of us have sort of heard of most of these other issues, but it's important to see that they are synthesized. That they're not sort of arcane in that sense. Marx's work was part of the scientific breakthroughs of the mid-19th century, subsequent organization of knowledge into modern academic disciplines. Besides the uh, significant developments in the social sciences, there were major discoveries in natural sciences, the Earth's geological history, biological cells, the origin of species, and energy transformation. And Marx's ideas were highly influenced by natural science and, of course, the metabolic rift and Liebig, etc. And we've looked at that in a variety of ways, and noting, of course, that it's not simply about the soil. Marx is trying to worry about, well, what is it that creates these integrated kind of rift problems? How is it that rent relates to that relative to Capital, Volume 3, etc. So based on Liebig's research, Marx's critique of political economy included an ecological critique dialectically connected to his overall analysis of capitalist production. The capitalist mode of production disrupted human relations to nature and thereby provoked an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism, a metabolism prescribed by the natural laws of life itself. Marx also developed the notion of sustainability, arguing that humans do not own the earth, but need to sustain it for future generations as quote unquote good heads of the household. Socialism was defined in Volume 3 of Capital as the rational regulation by the associated producers of the metabolism of nature and society to conserve energy and promote human development. And so all of this is there. It may seem repetitive, especially if you've done enough reading. But I think his presentation of this, I think, is sort of useful. Now, I think one of the key elements when he starts out with this is that communism is sort of possible, but it may be that we will never see it. It is it's a much larger, it's bigger than than we are, and that it's going to happen. If it happens, if it does happen, it's going to happen probably because we don't quite realize it, even though we've worked really hard to do it. It's hard to imagine that communism can exist as a local project. It would produce hostility with the surrounding capitalist world, and kind of the sort of history since the 19th century. And finally, the communism is not an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. It is a movement which abolishes the present state of things on the conditions of the existing world. So, and I think it's useful that he comes back to, and in a kind of simple way of considering it, is that the Communist Manifesto actually does synthesize all of these different positions and makes it kind of useful in that sense. So this presentation is worth reading simply because of it's well organized. It accommodates some things that, or at least for me, seemed more problematic at some moment in history, because one has lived through all those things. And one sort of needs to cope with them in a variety of ways. And this is why the Gabriel Rockhill stuff is useful, because it tries to address the larger set of critiques, the problem of post-war Western Marxism, the ones that the Lasordo is sort of annoyed with. And it's not reactionary in that sense. He wants to just simply put it in its place because, on the one hand, he explains all of the kind of fussing with a sort of petty bourgeois, kind of preoccupations, the professional managerial class, and one should not worry so much about that. One should see it just simply as this is what happens in the North, so to speak. I mean, stuff did happen in the South, but our relationship to sort of reconcile the global issues is to understand that there is a coherent way to look at post-war political events, post-war political economies, the question of center periphery. And I found it by the end, when he quotes the Chinese Communist Party from the 1920s about this idea that you could bring the country into the city. Now that sounds a little bit like the Cultural Revolution, but he thinks of it as kind of re-enveloping the city by bringing the country to the city. And at one level, it's just gentrification. I mean, if you want to just think of it in some class terms, but that's not what it's about. It is about sort of reconciling the relative proportions, which he covers, about the proportions of, how many people are poor in the world, how many people are peasants ultimately, and that, we're sort of lucky, fortunate that we're in the sort of top 10% that, allow us to sort of have these sort of indulgences, but to realize, of course, that there's this complete world out there. So communism and socialism are no longer utopian ideas of a better society, but a prognosis built on an analysis of history, sociology, and a critique of political economy. So he has this long and global perspective in investigating the struggle for socialism. Since capitalism was born, developed, and accumulated as a world system, the analytic perspective has to be global. And so the transformation towards socialism must comprise the vast majority of the world system to be affected. So the many national and local attempts to build socialism in the past 2 centuries have to be seen as part of a long transition process rather than failures, the failure of the Paris Commune, for example, or the failure, if you want to call it, of the Soviet Union, etc. So attempts which have contributed to the progress of the transition by modifying capitalism, as well as to the learning process of how to develop socialism. So historical periods do not follow one upon another as one step follows the other, but rather history moves often in leaps and bounds and in a zigzag line, as mentioned by Engels. And the different modes of production interpenetrate and coexist over a long period of time. So one needs to see revolutionary activity within not the context, and he deals with this actually in a fairly useful way. That what one needs to do in terms of national political change as being, it's important to see it. You can think about, for example, socialism with American characteristics, but to understand that that's not the answer. To assume that that's just not it would be hegemonic to think that would be the way forward. It is in fact just a something along the way. Any national revolution is a factor in changing the nature of not only a single nation, but also the entire world system. So the way capitalism works today is a product of the Russian Revolution and Soviet industrialization, the anti-colonial uprisings in the Third World, the 1968 uprising, and I'm glad that he acknowledges that kind of the position of that relative to Western Marxism, et cetera, and the current Chinese development of socialism. So 3 parts: method, core concepts, theoretical and philosophical reflections. And he introduces this idea of the principal, right? Principal contradiction, which shapes the transformation toward socialism. And so I'll just read this directly, because this little component here describes sort of the 3 big ideas that he's sort of working through that are interrelated, and they describe a certain way of talking about the dialectic. And to think of it as a quote unquote principal contradiction is, of course, sort of an interesting notion and worth following up on. Okay, as the development of capitalism is a global process, this process has a principal contradiction which shapes the transformation towards socialism. The principal contradiction is the specific historical presentation of the general contradiction in capitalism between the development of the productive forces and the mode of production. Recall that this we've yammered on, and Marx and Engels yammer on about this, the difference or developing the productive forces and this larger thing, the mode of production, not identical to the forces of production, which is a whole different thing. The principal contradiction changes over time as the balance of its aspects changes through feedback from class struggle generated by the contradiction. Now, note that this idea of feedback. It has circuits. It's Department 1 and 2, et cetera. Since the theme of the book is the transition from capitalism to socialism, I also discuss the basic differences between the 2 modes of production, that is, capitalism and socialism. First part ends with a discussion of some moral aspects of political struggle. And then in the second part, he uses methods and concepts to analyze the history of major revolutions and their interactions with the capitalist world system. And the Russian and Chinese revolutions and their subsequent attempts to construct socialism are, of course, important elements of analysis. The revolutionary spirit of the long 60s. Now, the long 60s, and it's just, I suppose it's a shorthand, but it really kind of describes not so much a decade. It's not decennial in that sense, but rather it describes about 20 years. That is from 1955, sort of, to 1975, which covers most of the, kind of turbulence of the 60s, whatever it is. And one shouldn't get too tied up in the, the numbers, et cetera. And you could even argue that it's a Kondratiev wave, but that's a whole nother story. And the various other attempts to build socialism in the Third World. However, this is not primarily a history book. I focus on forms of political action, types of movement, et cetera, what are to be learned from all these struggles. Marx and Engels had a general vision of the transition from capitalism to socialism as a series of revolutions starting in Western Europe, spreading globally, driven by a proletarian struggle with a degree of international coordination and solidarity. Hence, the need to organize something called the International. With Lenin, the Bolsheviks, the creation of a new type of long-term professional revolutionary, the strategy for the world revolution and the construction of socialism became a bit more specific. Revolutionary center had moved from the core of the advanced capitalist countries to its margins, Russia and China, due to their position as weak links in the capitalist world system. And by the time you get to the conclusion, hopefully you'll get an idea about, well, that there's still things to do. There's a kind of delinking the entire, sort of value chain. That's an important idea, and one that actually is very useful to think about at this, moment in time. Not that we're going to do it, all by ourselves or even as small groups. Now, this development was a consequence of the polarizing effect created by the colonial expansion of capitalism, which dampened the revolutionary spirit in the advanced countries in the West, yet amplified the need for a revolution in the East. So, there is a question of well, in traditional Marxist thinking, the socialist mode of production does not develop within the old capitalist mode of production as capitalism developed within feudalism, but rather replaces it when capitalism has exhausted its possibility to develop productive forces. So, without getting into the analytic details, something like that will happen probably. Whether we see it or not in our lifetimes may not necessarily happen, but one hopes that by the end of the century that probably something like that's going to happen. And the things that will make that happen are certain very key elements that he looks at in the concluding chapter, talking about certain things that need to change. Um, the hegemonic global currency called the dollar, that alternatives need to be created, that Belt and Road is, just a manifestation of this, and BRICS even as resistance to U.S. hegemony, the kind of um, gross, large scale hegemonic thing that's happens in the post-war period, Bretton Woods, et cetera, and all that has to be dismantled. I mean, it just has to be. And a multipolar world, because that's kind of what he gets to at the end, is what we're driving at. And it is a problematic code word because some people talk about it, and it is signifying a whole bunch of other left things. And so when anyone mentions multipolarity, there is that idea, conceptually speaking, but it is problematic because when Vladimir Putin talks about multipolar world, he's not talking about a socialist ideal. He's just talking about, uh, um, marginalizing his oligarchic either buddies or enemies, and it's about personal wealth and greed, and not really thinking so much about revolution as it is accumulation. But anyway, however, in Russia and China, capitalism was underdeveloped. The revolutions occurred because their route to the development of productive forces within the world system was blocked by imperialism. And this point that goes through the text about it is important to follow on Lenin. He comes back to Lenin, and I think that that's probably still the basic place to start. And after you do enough Lenin, you read Luxembourg, and you begin to think about, well, how does this all fit together? And I think that it's well, at least in this book, it's intelligible to me, and I found that very comforting in that sense. Long transition from capitalism to socialism has therefore evolved not only through the class struggle between capital and labor on the national level, but also through struggles between states who wanted to promote capitalism and the post-revolutionary states who want to use elements of capitalism to develop their productive forces in order to build socialism. This is the crux of the problem for considering many different political systems. So this is kind of the evolution that occurs, sort of Dangism, in the context of the People's Republic of China. And once you begin to think about it in that way, it makes certain other elements more clear. It doesn't excuse, the awful repression of Tiananmen Square, et cetera, and it doesn't fully explain the kind of and this is arguable, the kind of pro-democracy um, upheavals of the last decade in China, for example, or more in Hong Kong. But anyway, The long transition from capitalism to socialism therefore evolved not only through the class struggle between capital and labor on the national level, but also through struggles between states who wanted to promote capitalism, the post-revolutionary states who want to use elements of capitalism and to develop their productive forces in order to build socialism. So, on the one hand, we have a history, 200 years of unsuccessful attempts to end capitalism and construct socialism. Now, we don't dwell on the fact that it hasn't succeeded. I mean, I think eventually it will succeed only because the certain limits are being met. Ecological limits among demographic limits are going to socialism is going to happen one way or the other. Not that it's inevitable, but simply for all the historical materialist reasons and dialectical materialism, et cetera, capitalism will probably, it's not going to wither away, but it's going to be, people are going to see, well, we can't continue to do this, can't continue to elect orange-haired assholes, et cetera. On the other hand, it is obvious to more and more people that capitalism cannot continue as its form of accumulation creates misery along with the destruction of the global environment. Capitalism is ripe for replacement by another mode of production, which can provide an equal democratic world in balance with nature. But this leaves many questions. Replacement by what and how? And, which way is China heading? Are new revolutions on the horizon as consequences of the capitalist crises? Yes, like 2006 to 7 or 2008, whatever. Will capitalism break down in chaos from which a lifeboat socialism will emerge? There's a literature for this, and one shouldn't see it that way. I mean, I think it's problematic to see it that way, as though you were in a dinghy on the sea of capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. It's really a tedious metaphor. And ultimately, it doesn't work real well because it's not going to be that kind of situation. Although in a utopian way, I suppose you could indulge that story. Anyway, the third part of the book draws some lessons on how to construct socialism. Socialism mode of production is not an ideal utopia. I think he always addresses that key point as critique. Rather, it is a solution to the problems caused by centuries of capitalism. And if you want to look at you can indulge a history that takes the history of capitalism back to the 16th century at least, and it's arguable from a Western context, but it's there. The capitalist mode of production has turned from a dynamic system leading to the huge development of the productive forces to a system that blocks the solution to global problems, see, ecology, and thereby the continuation of human development on Earth. In other words, it's going to kill us all, and it could happen. The continued development of the productive forces demands a socialist mode of production. Task is to develop this mode of production as a realistic, rational praxis of how we manage society. How do we produce, divide, and consume the social products to solve global inequality and ecological problems? So in the final part of the book, the structural crises of capitalism, and he tries to shed some light on possible roads toward socialism. There's not one road, and there's many different roads, and it is problematic for all kinds of reasons. The contradictions of certain cultural constraints or demographic differences. And he doesn't talk a lot about that, but I would assert that there's the cultural elements are really problematic for all kinds, hopefully the obvious reasons that we're currently kind of confronting. Capitalism reached its zenith around 2000, the year 2000, still dominant, but it is in decline, reflected in the turn from neoliberal economic globalization towards military defense of a U.S. hegemony that is no longer economically based. That's kind of where we are right now. The decline of U.S. hegemony and the rise of China as a driver for a more multipolar world system can lead to a geopolitical balance in which social movements and nations in the global south can move in the direction of socialism. So it has similarities with what I was just mentioning, the long 60s of 1955 to 75, when the balance between the US and the socialist bloc led by the Soviet Union, the first world and the second world, opened up space for decolonization with a socialist perspective. However, at that time, Western capitalism was still virile. It was superior in technological terms. It was leading in industrial production, and it ruled the world market. So first world, second world, third world, right? All at the same time. Third world couldn't turn national liberation into economic liberation from imperialism. The socialist bloc at the time did not have the technological and economic strength to support such a change. Third world was not able to cut off the pipelines of imperialism. Instead, US imperialism wriggled free of the anti-imperialist offensive and launched neoliberal globalization as a counterattack, which gave it 40 golden years under US hegemony. That's kind of, you have the long 60s, and then you have kind of where we are, now, or the last 20 years. And, this is, there is some people refer to the post-war economy as the golden age of capitalism in that sense. That's a little wacky. The situation is different today. The U.S. is no longer the driving force in the development of productive forces on a global scale. It's pretty obvious that that's just not happening. There's going to be wars over chips, and I think that if certain other things happen, we'll probably see certain other horrible things happen in the next decade or so. They do not have a monopoly. The US, does not have a monopoly anymore on high-tech development, and they do not dominate global trade. And that's all that is true. Well, the socialist bloc was already in a political and economic downturn in the late 1970s. China has a tailwind. Now, without getting into a big argument about it, and I think he covers it partially, is this idea that, the late 1970s, from the Cultural Revolution on, I think that's actually an important moment, regardless of how it worked out. And a lot of people got messed over and et cetera. But I think it was an important moment in socialist history in that sense. So, driving force behind the effort to establish a multipolar world system, the intergovernmental organization BRICS has united the larger global South economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And of course, there's additional things. In August 2023, it also added Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, Argentina, and the United Arab Emirates. As the membership indicates, it is clearly not a socialist bloc. In fact, you could argue that it's a feudalist bloc in certain ways, or even an anti-imperialist bloc. That's pretty clear as well. It includes very reactionary and conservative capitalist regimes. What unites them is that they no longer believe that the interests of the West are equivalent to their interests. They want to develop an alternative to the US dollar-dominated trade and financial system, and many other countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are supporting this agenda. This is significant for shifts in the world balance, and so it's increasingly south-south as opposed to north-south. It's just demographically it's happening. After 500 years of uneven north-south economic relations, the decline of U.S. hegemony and the emerging alternative financial world system may give the third world the possibility to accomplish the economic transformation that it could not make in the 1970s. And, you can actually see why that didn't happen, or why it was blocked in that particular sense. And the same, and with all due respect, the same U.S. imperialism that is we're confronting now was still there. Now it's just simply baroque. It's like, we just nabbed the fifth oil tanker, a shadow oil tanker from Venezuela. So we're up to 5 now, even though we screwed up and pulled over something that probably shouldn't have been pulled over, et cetera. Imperialism is, let's get to the point here. The imperialism is crumbling. Ruling elite has calculated that the U.S. cannot compete with China economically, making China's rise an existential threat to the future of U.S.-led imperialism. This made the U.S. switch strategies from economic competition to geopolitical territorial rivalry. That's where we are now. However, in this process of economic warfare, using boycotts, sanctions, etc., blockades, and economic punishment packets, the transnational institutions built under neoliberalism are eroding. They are. I mean, 2006 to 8, the Great Recession sort of shows that. The globalized market of neoliberalism is split apart. The U.S. is destroying the goose, which for the past few decades was laying golden eggs. And the numbers actually show that. The transformation to socialism can be smooth as the global South gradually delinks from imperialism, building socialism with different national characteristics, and creating an alternative international economic world order. So that's kind of the whole business that one needs to sort of get at. Or the transformation can be traumatic, resulting in global wars, including the use of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Then the transition will be, if not the end, then starting from scratch. So we must avoid that outcome. We must avoid revolutionary adventurism in our strategy. And, that's often the negative thing that's laid on, various ideas and movements and actions. So if capitalism is still dominant in the second part of the century, that is after 2050, then catastrophic economic and social problems related to climate change will play a huge role. And you can already see that. The fact that they kick the can down the road in terms of 2030 targets being shifted to 2050 and blah, blah, blah. It is in these unstable and dramatic circumstances that the end game of capital, he devotes a whole chapter to the end game. End game, and it's not really like chess in that sense. End game of capitalism must be played out. And if you play a little chess, you know that the end games don't always play out. Anyway, sometimes you quit, you surrender. The strategy for the struggle is discussed at the end of the book. And yes, in the last chapter, which I've included here, you're going to see that as well. Anyway, in my analysis and discussion, I hope to develop a form of applied thinking that does not reduce itself to pragmatic or cynical reformism, nor turn into a critique based on abstract or romantic ideals of communism, nor devolve into explanations based on conspiracy and personal treason. There's that too. Much discussion related to the development of socialism has focused on the struggle between different political lines within communist parties operating first in the Soviet Union and then in China, instead of the actual material conditions which these lines represent. So it's not based on sacred socialist values, but on being rational. When things go wrong, it's not necessarily because of mistakes or treason of subjective forces, nor because of communists betraying the quote-unquote true values of socialism. The history he wants to review is not a history of morals. For a materialist approach, the questions of betrayal or rectitude have only minor relevance. The struggle for socialism is a collective project created by the effort and support of millions over the past 200 years. Specific economic and political constellation in the world system can make it impossible to move in the direction of socialism at any given point in history. A detour might be necessary. This does not mean that there are always excuses when things go wrong. Mistakes and treason happen. So we should be careful not to retreat to idealism and hand down a quick verdict, but rather conduct a dialectical, historical, material analysis of the facts that we might learn from history. So Hopefully some obvious things come from this. And the question of real movement, that is and this is this motion thing that I've mentioned before, that you see, that Marx is still talking about, the sort of dynamic nature that is part of that sort of principal contradiction analysis, or the idea of a principal contradiction, because it's not static or fixed in time. Rather, it is always being reworked or redone. So, needless to say, stable transition towards socialism will be limited if it only takes place in one country or region. There has been not one sole socialist country at any point in time, not in the Soviet Union, nor in China or elsewhere. Socialism in one country has obviously not been a success, even though it was, the whole modus, in terms of the Soviet Union, socialism in one country is going to, secure the future for socialism, and that didn't really happen either. A genuine and comprehensive transfer of capitalism to socialism has to involve the majority of the world. This is a global problem. This cannot be solved by trying to create a quote unquote ideal socialism in one country. Capitalism is a global system. Attempts to escape it from any nation state have immediately been confronted by the surrounding dominant capitalist powers. This always happens. That's why we get to 1991 essentially in Russia. However, the road towards global socialism passes necessarily through national struggles, and it doesn't mean that bad stuff happens. There's just one needs to sort of work through that, and so in this first section, or the first chapter, he begins to put down some key positions. And I like the way that he describes it. It's a useful way of explaining how one does dialectics. So that's also very useful in this chapter. There are many reasons why people want socialism. Some people want socialism because they can hardly earn a living despite working really hard. Other people want socialism because capitalism is in the process of destroying the Earth's ecosystem, or because, yes, it leads to war, right? Send in the troops, take over Greenland. Yet others want socialism because the current system causes alienation and stress. People shoot each other in the head, and they want more community, less inequality, more common property, and so on. Without anger and a burning desire to change the world, not possible to mobilize and organize the forces that will create radical change. It is in these forces we will call the subjective forces of revolution. So, he describes all of the different things, and that, they're all important. They're important in terms of the anti-colonial struggle and et cetera, but the wave fizzled out. Possibility of radical change depends not only on the wish, will, and organizational strength of the subjective forces, it also depends on the contradiction within the mode of production. That is, objective conditions. So the method section here, I think, is the most, well, for me, it was the most important, because it does explain how dialectics operates. And so historical and dialectical materialism are very broad terms, covering many approaches, reaching many different conclusions. Therefore, I need to be more specific in my definition of historical and dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is not just a research method. It is the conscious capacity of seeing society as a process and of understanding the direction and eventual goal of that process. The world is in constant transformation. Any phenomenon has a past and a future growing out of a synthesis of external and internal contradictions of that past. It presents itself to us in its current form. So this is already due to the action of its own combination of contradictions. So this whole idea of seeing it as a system of contradictions is really important. Changing and giving rise to different future possibilities. The future world both preserves traces of the past and gives rise to new relationship structures, activities, and ideas. So the meaning of seeing things as a whole lies in the ensuing capacity to act in line with reality thus understood. Future is dependent on the actions of people. And so what distinguishes Marxist analysis is that it produces the theoretical insight that complements the kind of action that changes the world. Lausen's interpretation of dialectical materialism is not very philosophical. It's more a tool for analysis to develop strategy and thereby practice. So I'm going to get sort of to the his little 3 pillars thing and then stop. My method, that is Lausen's, rests on 3 pillars. Pillar 1, the first, is the global perspective, which understands the world as a whole. As Marx writes in Conclusions of the Materialist Conception of History, the more the original isolation of these separate nationalities is destroyed by the developed mode of production and intercourse and the division of labor between various nations naturally brought forth by these, the more history becomes world history. That's the whole modus for, Wallerstein, etc. So global perspective grounded in both the history of capitalism as a world system and the development towards a global value of labor and goods within that system. Taking the global perspective might seem, sort of obvious, but not so. Most political strategies take the starting point of the local perspective, right? Politics is local, blah, blah, blah. And then add the international perspective as sort of this afterthought. And that may be useful from a sequence point of view, but you really need to think of all of these, that they're all interrelated. So that was pillar 1. Pillar 2 is the driver of this process, the contradiction between the development of the productive forces and the mode of production. So productive forces are, all those things, technology, blah, blah, blah. And the mode of production is the sort of the structure of these relations, that is feudalism, capitalism, socialism. The general contradiction, this general contradiction has taken different forms in the history of capitalism as the system attempts to find a way to continue the development of the forces of production within the capitalist mode. This leads us to pillar 3, the principal contradiction. If the development of global capitalism is one process, then this process has a principal contradiction. The principal contradiction determines the outcome of the local contradiction, but it is at the same time modified by it. So in this interaction, the principal contradiction changes over time. This is what I was saying. It's not static. The concept of the principal contradiction takes us from the general level to the specific level as a tool for developing strategy and practice. So global perspective is the first thing. The world system, this is Wallerstein, Emmanuel, etc. And these books are worth reading, partially because they describe an entire history that is referred to in a whole bunch of other things. And there's Andre Gunder Frank, Giovanni Arrighi, Arkiri Emmanuel, Samir Amin, Roy Mauro Marini, and Walter Rodney's work. All of those things, and we see them referred back to when Higginbottom has been talking about capital and his own interest in super profits and super exploitation and stuff like that. He's looking at Marini, partially because he's interested in Latin American stuff. So that kind of all fits together. Anyway, examples within and between radicals of Africa, Caribbean, and Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. So Emmanuel and Amin underline the transfers of value by unequal exchange between the so-called underdeveloped countries to so-called developed countries, and that this is the essence of capitalist accumulation on a world scale. And so you can just, you can map that sort of out. And world system does all this stuff, and this is how we get to globalized production chains linking together labor power in this North and South. Furthermore, with the increased industrialization of the global South over the last several decades, the level of technology and management regimes are also becoming similar on a global level. Brazil makes airplanes, for example, whatever, and cars. The value of a commodity is no longer based on varied and isolated national conditions. The value is based on global conditions, and as such, labor power has a globalized value. And as Samir Amin explained, quote, "My major contribution concerns the passage from the law of value to the law of globalized value, based on the hierarchical structuring itself globalized of the price of labor power around its value. This globalized value constitutes the basis for imperialist rents." It's all there in this one little thing. So the seaport worker who loads containers in Shanghai creates as much value as the port worker in Rotterdam who unloads them, assuming that the work is of the same intensity and uses the same technology. So the price of labor power, that is the wage, varies due to the different history, social relations, political conditions, and limited mobility of labor. And so it goes on through there, and the combination of globalized value and low wages in the South is the basis for the extraction of super surplus value. It's kind of what Higginbottom was talking about, super profits, which generates super profits for capital and relatively low commodity prices relative to northern wage levels. At Walmart, the difference between the value of labor and its price, therefore, corresponds to a transfer of value from the South to both capital and labor in the North. Therefore, that is Lausen's global perspective is founded on the historical development of the world system and the prevalence of globalized value capitalism. Now, what's the driver of the development? What's the contradiction that forces it to move ahead, constantly expand, change its appearance? The conventional Marxist answer is, of course, class struggle. However, change depends not only on the subjective conditions, it also depends on objective conditions. The real foundation upon which you build an entire superstructure, et cetera, that corresponding definite forms of social consciousness. The prospects of revolution are determined by whether the existing relations of production promote or inhibit the development of productive forces. So whether existing relations help or determine or affect the productive forces. So the status of that contradiction is what we call the material or objective conditions for revolution. And so now that's obviously much more complicated, and we can yak at great length about that. Class struggle is a manifestation of an underlying contradiction. What Marx and Engels discovered was the foundation on which class struggle takes place. So on the one hand, production maintains and develops society through a comprehensive division and organization of labor, that is the social character of production. But on the other hand, there exists the private ownership of the means of production, and thus the drive for private profit, regardless of the social needs or consequences. Somebody wants Greenland, and not for good purposes. With this contradiction in mind, Marx and Engels laid the foundation of historical materialism. And so the fundamental contradiction is between development of productive forces and relations of production. And so this is technology versus its organization. And that tends to define classes, as I think we all appreciate or know. So, despite the damaged brand of socialism in the past decades, this contradiction is expressed in common everyday considerations. Why not share and have more common wealth instead of individual consumption? Why are the financial capitalists so damn greedy and rich while there's so many poor people? Well, it's because they have cops. That's what cops are for. Why do humans not live in balance with nature and instead destroy the living conditions of future generations? Because the conflict between capital and labor is the class expression of the basic contradiction of society. It's obvious that it ultimately determines when the class contradiction assumes the form of open antagonism, shoot you in the face, and develops into revolution. When the property relations, that is, the way we produce and consume, conflicts with the development of the productive forces, then economic, political, and ecological crises develop, and revolution is, as they say, around the corner. So, you know, in such an era, different revolutionary processes develop. You have to, and can be explained on specific national contradictions in their interaction with the global principal contradiction at the time. So this is the issue for Lenin, for example. Lenin, to talk about imperialism as this, big thing that's problematic, but also, the reasons to do socialism are founded in that set of relations. So, looking at the history of the transformation from feudalism to capitalism, we find that, in fact, in no instance do we encounter a pure bourgeois revolution. Similarly, for the transition period from capitalism to socialism, there's no pure socialism. And, once you get past that, it becomes easier to talk about. It's not ideal. It's not going to be perfect. It's problematic. And the constraints on it, of course, are, the changes in productive forces, et cetera, demographic changes, et cetera. So there's constant struggle between the different aspects of contradiction. And you can talk about it mathematically, but, it's there. From capitalism to function, must constantly seek a specific historical form that allows it to secure profits and continue to accumulate capital. This historical form is determined by class struggle. The economic laws create class struggles that affect these laws by modifying the relations of production, creating new frameworks for continued development of the productive forces. Now, this occurs not only in the national level, but also in the world system of nation states. So the class struggle on a national level shapes the economy and the policy of the state, which is part of the world system. States interact, compete to secure their development based on their class character. The national class struggle affects the world system, which in turn affects the national class struggle. So there's a sort of transitivity built in here. Thus, in the dialectic between economics and class struggle, we should avoid this is an important sentence in this work. Thus, in the dialectic between economics and class struggle, we should avoid complete determinism and instead think in terms of conditioning. It's the kind of thing you want to ask him a question, and he's not here to answer the question. And so there's different historical versions of this, inequality built in from colonialism, stuff like that. And then we get up to, oh, yes, he does a thing on spatial fix, which I find useful. However, at this point in history, it seems that capitalism is running out of both humans and nature to exploit. That's kind of where we're headed. There's no spatial fix as forecasted by Rosa Luxemburg in 1913. Once this is reached, Marx's model becomes valid, i.e., further expansion of capital becomes impossible. Capitalism comes to a dead end. It cannot function anymore as the historical vehicle for the unfolding of the productive forces. It reaches its objective economic limit. Now, you can see how dogmatic that can become in terms of doing math and stuff to say, well, the contradiction gets so big, the profits, eventually fall, capitalism withers away, all that problematic. So let me close on this. The principal contradiction, because I think the idea of a principal contradiction, as totalizing as that might be, is still a useful concept to have. If we have a capitalist world system in the historical sense of Emanuel Wallerstein and the economic sense of Samir Amin, and if we consider the world system as one process, then at any given point in time, this process has a principal contradiction emerging from the multiple contradictions in the capitalist mode of production, driving its development forward. The principal contradiction affects all national, regional, and local contradictions decisively. Like other contradictions, the principal contradiction changes during the course of history. The interaction between the principal contradiction and other contradictions is not one-sided. Particular national and local contradictions affect the principal contradiction. This feedback affects the struggle between the aspects of the principal contradiction and can change the direction of its development. Mao says this about the principle. This is where it gets important, because the Maoist kind of move allows for a certain kind of clarity, even though it probably gets lost in translation. Mao says this about the principal contradiction. If in any process there are a number of contradictions, one of them must be the principal contradiction playing the leading and decisive role, while the rest occupy a secondary and subordinate position. Therefore, in studying any complex process in which there are two or more contradictions, we must devote every effort to finding its principal contradiction. Once this principal contradiction is grasped, all problems can be easily solved. Would that it be so easy? So the expression readily solved should be taken with a grain of salt, not least when talking about social problems and the revolution in a country the size of China. What Mao means when he says readily is that you have a reliable guide for further analysis once you identify the principal contradiction. In other words, the critical problem of defining useful strategies, policies, means of propaganda, military efforts are solved. Additionally, it's important to find the dominant aspect in the contradiction. As Mao states, it's a big mistake to look at the two aspects of any contradiction as though they are equal. Of the two aspects, one is inevitably the principal and the other the secondary. He's just describing the unevenness, the asymmetry that causes the motion of all of this stuff. The secondary aspect, and the former is the aspect, so aspect and secondary aspect, which plays the contradiction's so-called guiding role, its actuality, which aspect is principal? It's necessary to observe the situation of the development of process, and it will be determined under definite conditions. So he sort of kicks the can down the road. But if you look in Mao at various applied versions of this, discussions on art, for example, that talks at the Yan'an Forum, etc. You can sort of see where he's trying to get to with it. In defining the principal contradiction, we move from the abstract and general to the specific and concrete, to practice. When we act, we do it where we are situated. What else can we do? However, we should act locally from a global perspective and bear in mind the principal contradiction. So, a determinate historical situation is characterized by a variegated multiplicity of conflicts, and every conflict involves the presence of a multiplicity of individuals and classes who express different opposing interests and ideas. So, to analyze and get one's bearings in such a complex situation is necessary to examine not only the internal configuration of each contradiction, but also how they interact and are structured in a concrete totality. Mastering this is a challenge theoretically as well as politically. Now, you can argue that this is the fundamental notion of self-criticism, and I don't want to go there necessarily, but self-criticism, I think, builds on this idea of how you think about contradiction. To identify the principal contradiction at a certain point in history, we must consider more than the general abstract contradictions. Contradictions such as productive forces versus relations of production, proletariat versus bourgeoisie, and imperialism versus anti-imperialism usually do not cause much controversy among Marxists. No, Disagreements begin when we move from general to specific contradiction, and we need to identify the principal contradiction at a given time and place, the contradiction with the highest revolutionary potential. Note that Mao speaks of finding the principal contradiction in the quote above. This cannot be done by theoretical speculation. Contradictions are concrete phenomena. They reveal themselves in economic developments, in political action, and popular movements. So, as I emphasize the global perspective and the principal contradiction, it's important to underline the dialectic. The world level theory and universal trends consist of all the particularities. It's through the particular and the local that we can act. We need to see how the principal contradiction is created and formed by the multitude of particularities, and how the principal contradiction determines the outcome of particular contradictions. It's not only a theoretical issue, the grand theory of the global perspective without a dialectical understanding of the relations of the particular is of no practical use. It may give you pleasure to understand how the world works and a platform from which to voice how unjust and equal the world is and how it needs to be changed. However, grand theory alone offers no viable path towards an effective praxis. The meaning of seeing things as an interconnected whole lies in the ensuing capacity to act in line with reality thus understood. The purpose of identifying the principal contradiction is to intervene in it. It is the conscious capacity of seeing the world system as a process and of understanding the direction and eventual goal of that process. We cannot create contradictions, but we can influence the aspects of existing ones so that the contradictions move in a way that serves our. So there's a pragmatism that's built in here. So identifying the principal contradiction tells us where to start. To sum up, in the circle analysis in part 2, I will examine how the general contradiction, that is productive forces versus relations of production, manifests itself in the specific revolutionary process on the national level. And I think you can actually see that in every attempt at socialist revolution. Moreover, I will examine how these national and regional contradictions interact with the changing principal contradiction at the global level. Historical changes happen in qualitative leaps. The productive forces change constantly, as he said before, and with them, power relations between classes. Eventually, this leads to tensions that shatter the frameworks of the old society and make the way for a new one. To then analyze the transition from capitalism to socialism, I have to specify the very concept of socialism. So that's chapter 1. I'll stop there, mainly because I've yammered for about an hour. And I urge you, I've done a video of this entire last chapter. I find it quite useful because it kind of explains most of what's going on in the current day. A whole bunch of issues that are, well, for me, it was very, clarifying to think that Belt and Road is a means by which we can get to revolution. Not because we sort of are propping up the sort of exchange and trade, but rather it creates alternative means to think about capital. And short of revolutionizing the larger institutional structures like the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the BIS, et cetera, et cetera. Those things have to change. And I can just see how that, I can see how it can happen, but, it's not for me to do that change. Anyway, enough. I'm going to stop here. For those who came in late, I've been yammering about this book, which is available in the file. I did 2 videos related to it. It's a useful little book. It reads quickly, is historically amusing. The long transition towards socialism and the end of capitalism, Torquil Lauesen. And it is a Iskra book, and it's free. You can download it, the PDF version. And I think you can see, just to close, these are the chapter headings: Communist Spectre of 1848, the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune, which we've looked at before, from revolutionary France to German reformism. That's actually a very key element. the establishment of the Second International. Now, we can argue about that till the cows come home, I suppose. Russian Revolution, 1917, the attempt to build socialism under Lenin, revolutions that failed in Europe, that you wind up in all kinds of terrible stuff there. The Third International, that is the Comintern, also, has its own problematic history. And then Stalin, Chinese Revolution, Third World, Cultural Revolution, 68, 70, the end of actually existing socialism, 91, Chinese encounter with neoliberal globalization, kind of where we are just before the rise of Xi Jinping, and then Xi Jinping. All right, so that's it.